If you're a company of 5, 10, 20 people, it's relatively easy to build an employer brand. You look around, you look at the culture, you look at what's going on, you look at why people work there, and you define your brand. As companies get bigger, that process gets harder. And when you're talking about companies of 500, 5,000, 500,000, the only way to really understand what it's like to work in the company is to leverage data. Now, over the next 2 episodes of The Brand Plan, that's what Marcus and I are going to talk about, data. In this first episode, we'll be focusing on the input data points, the things you use, the things you should be looking for when developing your brand.
You're listening to The Brand Plan, the podcast about the intersection of talent, brand, and strategy, with your hosts Marcus Body of 33 and James Ellis of Employer Brand Labs.
Hey, Marcus.
Hey, James. How's it going?
It's good. It's good. It's been a crazy week this week, but I think I'm seeing the other side of it, which is really good. How about you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've just been looking forward to. We're finally at the episode where I can kind of ramble on about data for a bit. And, we couldn't do it at first until we got some people to listen to some other things first. But, we're on to one of my pet topics.
And it's not, and full disclosure, it's not just going to be one episode. It's a double. It's a 2-header. It's going to be,
Yeah, I think, the bad news for the listeners is we had a chat about this and we decided we couldn't do data in one episode because there's just too much to get into. And we scratched our heads for a bit and we think we've got a formula for how we're going to break it up, which is this week we'll talk about input data. What data are you using to make decisions and decide what you are going to say and what you're not going to say and where you're going to say it. And then next week we'll look at output data, which is how do we know any of this is working? How are we going to calculate our ROI? How are we going to decide, when we have made a quality hire, which I think is a bigger and more complicated topic. But let's start with the inputs.
Yeah. It's tough because I think employer branding and talent strategy encompasses so much. It's trying to encapsulate. It's doing an almost impossible job. It's trying to tell a story in as concisely and precisely as possible, and it can. I imagine it's like I'm probably going to miss it. It's just the plague. Camus. One of his main characters can't write a novel because he has to make sure every word is precise. And I think on a lot of levels, companies have a similar kind of challenge thinking about their employer brand and all, because all the data is coming in, and they know if they wait 12 seconds, there's more. So it kind of slows them down. So I hope that we can kind of have this conversation, not just in terms of look at all the data, and Marcus can totally nerd out, engineering style, which is going to happen. But also, what do you really need, and what's the minimum amount of data that's useful, and how do you know when you're good to go?
Absolutely. Although, honestly, we could just nerd out on Camus. I love that book. It's the town clerk, and he gets stuck on his opening line. But let's leave that one to one side. I think there's. We talked about it in an earlier episode. There's a lot of people who've got an enthusiasm to be data driven, but I think that enthusiasm can lead you to make some mistakes if you try and believe that the data says something that it doesn't. Mm-hmm. And what I want to reassure people is there is a way of using data well, but some of the using data well is understanding when you're going to reject the data and go, no, that's not good enough. I'm going to not pay too much attention to it. But I think there are a few different types of data I'd love us to get into over the course of this next episode. And I think one of the topics might be a good place to start is market data. How are you going to decide what is going on in the outside world? You've been set some targets. The business has come to you and said, hey, we want to hire these kinds of people in these sorts of places. How are you going to help yourself and the business understand this is what the talent landscape looks like right now. Okay, how fierce is the war for talent in the battles I'm going to be fighting within that war? And, really, how do I start managing expectations, or indeed lobbying for more budget and say, look, this thing you want me to do, that's going to be really difficult. Whereas this thing over here, that one looks okay. And where are you going to go for that stuff? I think is a good starting point. And there are a bunch of different places you can go for that kind of stuff is the good news.
And this is most necessary, I would suspect, in either big companies where they are effectively scraping every college class, they're scraping every they're grabbing in sheer bulk rates those people, whatever they're doing, or super niche markets, right? If you are Colorado School of Mines only graduating a couple dozen people every year, but every one of them is an expert, and there are 3-4 companies who want them all. So
Yeah,
that's a place where knowing the total number of potential applicants, the total number of potential talent, the understanding the scope of what you're dealing with is incredibly critical. To assume that there's always more fish in the sea, so to speak, is not always the smart strategy.
no, exactly. And for those of you who have kind of global responsibilities, things can start to get a bit messy. So, if you've got a hiring target in Berlin, for example, some data on Germany is useful, but I'm going to say you also need to be looking at the data from Poland, because actually people move countries in the EU. It's easy within the Schengen area.
Yeah,
Not for the Brits.
it's a whole union. It's
Well,
a
yeah.
whole union.
Not for us anymore. But yeah. So actually, the way that the data is divided up is sometimes not how you're going to need to look at it anymore. And likewise, for an awful lot of you, you're recruiting in a specific place in America. Knowing how many people there are in the United States who have this qualification is not that useful. You need to know how many there are in northern Florida, in reality, because that's where you're going to be hiring from. So it's going to change for each of you what data you want to be drawing on. But there are, the good news is this is one of the longest standing things governments have ever been interested in. We've got 4,000-year-old records of the Egyptian government asking people what they did for a living.
Yeah.
It is one of the first things governments started deciding they should ask about is, how are you earning your money? So there is governmental data about this. And yeah, if you're in Egypt, there's 4,000 years worth of governmental data on
That's
this.
some longitudinal data.
Yeah, yeah. So there is a lot of data on this. If you're recruiting in the UK, there's a specific government body, the Office of National Statistics, who hold a pile of data about this and are constantly updating that data set. And every single country in the world has some level of data on this. Exactly how precise that data is going to depend on where your government has decided to invest their money.
Yeah.
But that data tends to be quite well done. If they're bothering to do it at all, they tend to do it in quite a rigorous way. What is always maddening is the way that they decide to classify that data.
Yeah.
And the way that they decide to group things together will drive you bonkers. As a specific example, the UK government drive me mad because they've decided that psychology is a subset of biology. So you always look at the data and go, why have we got so many qualified biologists in the UK? And you go, oh no, we haven't. Loads of them are in fact psychologists. It's just that someone at the Higher Education Statistics Agency decided that psychology was a subset of biology for reasons best known to them.
Yeah.
And now that confuses the data set. So you sometimes have to go and dig into those data sets to kind of figure out what we'd like the government to have asked as opposed to what they did ask.
Yeah.
And that's going to be easier for some of you. Some of you know which sector you're in, and it'll be easy to find your sector data. Some of you do something where it's quite difficult to figure out which sector you're in the governmental data set. So, as a specific example, recruitment advertising agencies are not a subset in the government data set. There is a kind of creative industries one. We're probably in there, we think, maybe, but even we don't know where our data goes in the government data set. We can make a sensible guess.
Yeah.
And that's going to be, but it's always the first place to start. Is go and have a look at that and see what there is. It is very often, because governments don't move quickly, it's very often 5 years out of date. It's very often old.
And look, the world is changing so fast. The skill you're looking for may not even have a name, let alone something the government documents against and has a place to collate and calculate that relative to larger population size.
Exactly. So I bet most governments right now have a pretty good read on how many IT professionals they are. They don't have a very good read on how many AI professionals there are, for example, because it wasn't interesting enough last time they updated the set of survey questions. Eventually, they will start recording that stuff, but they're not there yet, and they're probably not going to get there yet for a while, because an awful lot of people have to agree before the government can change its question. So it's a good place to start. It's always where you're going to get your headline number when you're talking to senior stakeholders and you go, right, the number of people in the labour market has gone down, therefore this is why we're struggling to hire. How relevant it's going to be is to some extent how big an employer are you. If you're a big employer, that starts to become really useful data. If you're a really little employer, you start going, yeah, that's probably not going to be as useful, and I probably need to find something more local. But this is where your local authority may have more, whether it's your state government, whether it's your city government. In the UK, we have the chambers of commerce. I don't know if you have the same setup in America, but local business associations essentially that will exist as well. And they sometimes hold some data on what does the local labour market look like, how many local employers are there in your sector, roughly how many people are they employing in this region,
Yeah.
that starts to become very helpful for making that case about that thing you asked me to do. This is why it's going to be quite difficult or quite easy, or why the talent isn't here and we're going to have to go and get it from somewhere else. That certainly can be very useful.
So
So there's
provided,
all of that.
yes, so provided you can't get it from the government, where do you go next? Because it could potentially out of date, potentially fuzzy. It's designed not for you. It's designed for a
Yeah.
whole whole different purpose. So where do you go next?
Well, there's the where do we go next or where should we go next? Where we do go next
that is a great question.
is Google. We all go to Google, right? There is no secret here,
Yeah.
and that is what we all do. And we start Googling for the data set we wish existed. And you start Googling for, AI professionals in the southwest of the UK, or whatever the thing you really wanted to know was, and you try and find what you can find. And there are various people who might have that data, but you're now into the realms of these are now people who have a commercial agenda in play, and that's going to play into that data. So you might find that there are kind of data organisations who say that they've got some data on this, and there are big global polling companies who might say, "Oh, we've got a piece of data that does that thing that you want," but now you're going to have to pay to buy it off them because that's their business, is selling that data. You might find that there are trade associations who have relevant data to you. So if you're an accountancy firm, there are going to be accountancy bodies who hold data on how many accountants they are and who they work for and what kind of stuff they do. So they have some stuff that you might be able to access. There are media providers who might have stuff. So you might have a website that serves your sector that has some data on, if you're a law firm, there are websites devoted to the law sector that do law news, and they have some data on where people are accessing their site from and levels of experience. They might know quite a lot about their users if they require a sign up. So they're a potential data source. But of course, we're now into the realms of, we're talking about data from people who have a commercial agenda.
Yeah.
And that commercial agenda might start to interfere with what data they are collecting, and even more so, what data they are prepared to share. Any data that is bad news for them, they're not going to tell you. Even if they've got it, they are going to hold on to that, and they're going to keep it hidden from you.
Yeah.
So I think those are kind of the other big data sources.
What about
But there are
LinkedIn?
also
Could we talk about LinkedIn? That's self-reported data. I mean, I myself have tried to figure out how many employer brand professionals are there in the United States or in the world, and that number fluctuates pretty fast. As both people decide that that's a thing they do, or that's what it's called. But also, it's hard to kind of know. I mean, LinkedIn is it's not well known for having a strong search engine, so even that sometimes is hard to kind of rely upon.
I think for all sorts of reasons, LinkedIn keep changing what you're able to interrogate from their data set as well, because they get a bit nervous if you're interrogating it too much about all sorts of things to do with data protection, but also to do with whether this is a sellable product that LinkedIn could be making some money out of. They used to have a fantastic search functionality, for example, where you could look at any education institution in the world, like Harvard, and it would tell you where everyone who graduated from Harvard worked. They disabled that function because too many people were using it. And it was too useful. And it really annoyed me when that disappeared. But they have amazing data.
And,
how much
and
you're
they
able
sell
to
it to
access.
you. But they will sell it to you. You can ask for custom reports. If your boss is begging you for this information, you can absolutely request a custom report from them.
Absolutely. Some things you might be able to work out for free by doing searches in LinkedIn, but yeah, the best stuff, the gold dust, they want to charge you for. And actually, it's not unreasonable for them to charge you for it. It is an incredibly valuable piece of information that they own. Fair enough, all right, they're allowed to monetize it. I'm annoyed that I can't get it for free anymore. But what you always have to remember about LinkedIn, and someone pointed this out to me a long time ago, and it's never left my mind, is all the data on LinkedIn is what people say they are on their LinkedIn profile. It's not necessarily true. My favourite story about this is there's a guy who I'm connected to on LinkedIn now because I thought it was hilarious, a Dutch guy called Robrecht, who decided to see what happens if I just declare I'm the CEO of Shell.
Yep, I've seen that. Yep.
So he changed his job title to CEO of Shell on LinkedIn, and he suddenly, the whole way LinkedIn behaved started changing for him. Different people contacted different things, but there was no check that he was CEO of Shell, and he wasn't CEO of Shell. He's an IT guy, I think. But the whole of LinkedIn relies on us all telling the truth. And some people tell more truthful things than others in their LinkedIn profiles. So if you search for a skill set on LinkedIn, LinkedIn can only tell you who's got that skill set, who says they've got that skill set, not who actually has that skill set. And we all know fully that there are some people out there who are over declaring skills.
I don't know what you mean. I don't know what that's
Yeah.
like. And I certainly don't get those messages from those people who have amazing skill sets they're offering me at a fabulous discount price.
Yeah. And likewise, we know there's a bunch of people who aren't declaring skills because they've got fed up of being played by recruiters. So actually they're under declaring stuff. So it's not a perfect data set, but it is a very big one. So it's quite a good one.
I feel like we could put the label of it's not a perfect data set on everything we're about to talk about and everything we have talked about. Like that's a blanket kind of asterisk to the whole thing.
Yeah. The one I think loads of people miss until I suggest it to them very often is there's a qualitative data set out there for you, for most of you, which is you've got a preferred supplier list of external recruiters working with you who want to remain a supplier to you. Ask them, what's the market like? They might know stuff that you don't. They might know qualitatively, right, these kinds of employers are hiring more, those kinds of employers are hiring less. And they might be prepared to give you a kind of off the record or kind of high level view of how the world looks from their business revenue and their business plan, which actually can be incredibly helpful. This is when you find out, oh, everyone in our sector is hiring at the moment. They're like, yep, the phone's off the hook. Sorry, this is why I couldn't get back to you for 2 days. It's because I'm flat out at the moment. How busy your preferred supplier list is often a very good clue to what's going on in the market. It won't give you a number, but it might well give you that real insight into what's actually happening, particularly in your competitor set, because they're probably working with them too.
It's not the data, it's the flavor, it's the sense, it's the sensation around it.
But very often, that's the piece of data that is going to convince your senior stakeholder is one of our preferred supplier lists said that all of our competitors are paying 10% more than we are in the market. Right, okay, that is a piece of data that actually, even though it only comes from one person and it's a quote and it's qualitative, that will have more power than anything you get out of a government data set because it feels, and also probably because it's current and live.
Yeah.
So that's a really useful data source, and I'm constantly surprised how many people are not wringing data out of that, because that is a bunch of people who will talk to you because they've got a commercial incentive in talking to you. They won't necessarily always entirely tell you the whole truth and nothing but the truth because they don't want to offend you. And sometimes it's not a bad thing to give them permission to say, look, tell me the stuff that you think I don't want to hear as well as the stuff that you think I want to hear. Manage that relationship because they hear things that you won't hear.
Yeah. That brings up a quote from Rory Sutherland, who I know you know, amazing book. And but if you haven't read Alchemy, please do. What I like about one of the quotes, and he's a quote machine, if ever there was one.
Oh, yes.
We all aspire, those of us who are loudmouths aspire to that level of quotedness. I guess that's the phrase. What the hell? But he says that all data, especially when you're talking about big data, all data comes from the same place, the past. And that you got to keep that in mind that, especially when we're talking about government data, especially when we're talking about longitudinal data, trends don't work that way. Look at the stock market. Just because it was going up doesn't mean it's going to always go up. It's just because everything is in the past and it has to be filtered through the filters of, look, this is how things are working. These are the trends, but this is what we expect to really happen.
Absolutely, absolutely. And strong recommend, if you've got any spare time, go onto YouTube, watch Rory Sutherland's speeches. They are always incredibly funny and very, very insightful as well. But
I say he's probably the world's greatest podcast guest. Because honestly, as a host, you just go, so Rory, how you doing? And then 45 minutes later, you said, so about that. And that's all you got to do. And that he just runs. He's amazing.
Absolutely. I remember watching him do a speech a while ago where he claimed he'd recently returned from TED Evil, where they all meet up and work out how to do bad things and corrupt the world. And it's a very funny opening to a kind of speech, but actually it's an interesting way of looking at the world. How would I do bad things with all of this knowledge that I have? And sometimes it can be quite a productive way of provoking new ideas into your mind.
Your career site is a kind of litmus test for your entire talent strategy. It should pique the interest and engage the people you most want to hire. Does your career site connect your company to the people you are trying to attract? Is it tailored to what candidates want to learn and how they want to learn it? Have you even updated it in the last year or two? If it's time to rethink your career site and make it a more strategic element in your recruiting plan, stay tuned.
But anyway, back to the point of, this is the kind of market data most of you are going to have. Some of you might have more than that, but I think that's probably the limit of what most of you are going to end up looking at. And I think, just don't try and oversell it and overuse it. Look at what you have been able to find. And actually, you can go to your stakeholders and say, if you need more data than this, you need to give me some budget to go and create it.
Yeah.
And then you can go and anything you want to know, eventually you can work out a way to pay for it to be done.
Yes.
And there are polling companies out there you can pay to go and fill in the gaps in your data set if you really want to. There is always a way of doing that. You can get street research done. We've done street research recently for a client who wanted some data in a particular market in Arizona. We said, well, look, that's not going to be purchasable. We can do it, but we're going to need to commission a street research, literally go and ask people some questions. It's fine, we can do that.
Yeah.
And there are always expensive and cheap ways of doing that. I did some work with a food hospitality business in London, and the street research we did is I sent my junior to kind of wander down the backs of all the restaurants along Oxford Street and chat to the people having their cigarette breaks.
Yeah.
And it wasn't the most scientific thing, but it was cheap and it was quick, and it gave us a quick flavour of how everyone felt about working at these different competing restaurants in one long row. So we'd kind of disambiguated for geography and all of that. Is that a perfect way of doing that research? No, but it's quite cheap and it's quite quick. We had the answers in 2 hours flat.
Yeah. And it certainly beats. I had a client at a previous job where they said, we need to talk to enough people with MDs and JDs. That means they had to be a medical doctor with a law degree. And I'm like,
right.
Mentally doing the math.
Quite
what
a small subset.
Yeah. How 4, 3 maybe? He's like, no, actually there was a couple of hundred of them. I'm like, oh, a couple of hundred. Sure. And they wanted to know, because this was in pharmaceutical, they needed someone who understood the both sides of that sort of thing. Yep. And we could put that together. That was a thing that is doable. So you can get incredibly granular. The price goes up every time you make it a little more granular, and the price goes up the more you try to make it statistically significant. So everything comes at a cost. Exactly.
A client many years ago who said, I want to know what is thought about coming to work in the private sector by the kind of person who has a PhD in astrophysics or maths or physics from either Oxford or Cambridge.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And I said, right, okay, the full answer to that is
I asked Bob, and he said...
Well, I said the cheap way is, I know 4. I can message them on Facebook and have you an answer by the end of the day, because because I happen to do engineering there. I know 4 from my age. They're all the same age, unfortunately, but I can get you their answer by the end of the day for free. If you want to know the full answer and people who've done it more recently, that's going to cost you some money, because that's a very... specific ask that will take us some time to locate. But very often you're not going to get into that realm. It's going to be, what can I grab now? What can I use now? And that's probably going to be enough for most of you. Yep. Your agency, if you're working with one, should be able to help you with this, though. They should have a team. Like ours is called the Brand and Insight team, but at a different agency, it might be called the planning team, it might be called the research team. But there should be someone who either has some data sets or can help you wrangle the data sets you've found and figure out what they really say.
Or they've got somebody on call.
Exactly. And, and again, if you're working with an agency, they should be sending you stuff from time to time as well. We do a regular thing called Megatrends that goes out to our clients, or to those clients to whom we think it's relevant, of here is a thing that we've been looking at that we think is kind of interesting. So we did a report recently on rehiring older workers in the UK, because that's become a thing. How do you get people back into the workforce? We spent some time out of it. Governmentally, that's become quite an issue, because we've got a shrinking workforce in the UK. And that's a problem. So loads of employers have been asking about it. We did a report on it ahead of any clients asking for it and sent it to the ones for whom it's relevant.
Yeah.
So
that's the thing. You gotta, and this is going off topic, and as soon as I say this, I'm going to swing us back around. But I think you got to be able to use your agencies properly, and it doesn't mean just asking for work and taking work. It means understanding they have a perspective, and a wider perspective in a way that you simply don't have. And if they're not giving it to you, you should be asking for it. It is part of the deal.
Definitely. And it's where, way back when you chose an agency, if you're working with an agency, some of you will have chosen an agency that doesn't work with anyone else in your sector, because you thought, oh, that's great, we can be their only client in their sector. And some of you will have chosen an agency that does work with other people in your sector. Yeah. If they work with other people in your sector, they're going to have a lot more information and a better view and a more informed thing. But it does also mean they can't give some of it to you because it belongs to that other competitor, or the other competitor paid for it. So there's a trade-off there that's quite tricky. They will always tell you what they can, but they can't give you anything that the other guy's paid for. That wouldn't be right.
Yep. Totally. So, I mean, there's a lot of ethical boundaries there. So, but you
Completely.
start by asking. All right. So
Absolutely.
we've collected market data. We've collected broad
Yeah.
market data. We understand, okay, the lay of the land. Where do we go next? What's a useful data? What's a useful data set or a useful question to be asking as we're building our strategy or as we're building our brand?
So I think the massive one, and the one that we're probably going to spend most of the rest of the podcast talking about, is where do you get data on you and how you're seen?
Correct.
And that is the one that, whether you're developing an EVP or whether you're just looking at, next year's graduate recruitment campaign. So whether you're doing it at a very big scale, a very small scale, how do you find out how people feel about you? And the obvious one, which we've talked about before and we're going to talk about again now, and I've no doubt we'll talk about again in the future, is what are you going to do about Glassdoor?
Yep.
But that, it's not the only one. Some of you might be buying data sets that tell you how people feel about you and your competitors, and they might be focused on particular talent audiences, or they might be very broad and generic. There's certainly several that you might be buying in the graduate recruitment and internship space,
Yep.
where this is how students feel about your company, this is how they see you relative to the others. There are some you can buy off the shelf, but you could also, again, in this space, be commissioning something and going, right, if there isn't anything out there that I want, then I think once we've talked about those a little bit, we might get into the internal data as well. So let's talk about Glassdoor, James. Let's get into how do you tangle with Glassdoor data? Dramatic thunder in the background as we talk about.
I know. It's so telling. It's
But how good is the data on Glassdoor, and how are you going to look at it? And I think that's a different thing. And some of you, the complexity is going to be is that some of the data is just flat wrong.
Yeah.
The one that the very obvious one is if you work at a business that has a franchise model, a ton of the people who leave Glassdoors for you don't work for you. They work for one of your franchisees, but they forget that, and so they review you, and they're going to appear on your data. And the best one I ever ran across was so when I was working with CERN, most of the people at CERN physically don't work for CERN. They're at a university. They're at the University of Manchester or the University of Cambridge or the University of Bologna, but they're on site at CERN and they review CERN as an employer. CERN is not and has never been their employer, but they don't think of that. They tell their friends, oh, I work at CERN, despite the fact they're not an employee. And they have this problem that an awful lot of their reviews are in fact not from employees at all. They're from people who are just physically working at this research institution.
That's the power of the brand right there.
Exactly. So some of you are going to have really complex landscapes that some of the data isn't even really about you, but it's going to look that way. So if you're using it as a data source, you have to look at that and go, how sure am I that all the people reviewing this are actually correct, that they do work for me? If you're a small employer, that's unlikely to be a problem. If you're a big employer, that can start to be a significant problem, is that some of these people might be contractors who don't actually work for you, but they're still reviewing you because they go to your office every day and they work on a project for you, and they forget that technically they're employed by this subcontractor. And you don't know, that can be really complicated for big employers, is who is this review actually from?
Yeah.
I think then you have to look in the motivations of why has someone gone to Glassdoor. And that's where you get into a lot of the people who've gone to Glassdoor because they're angry.
Yeah. Well, it's the powerful emotions that push you there. No one's meh on Glassdoor. I love it, I hate it, and there's very little in between. And I know internally companies like to talk about, hey, go on Glassdoor, review us, and you'll get a couple of meh, but mostly you're going to get the most polarizing points of view.
Although, I've always been astonished at how many people there are who will go and leave mediocre interviews of things on the internet. If you go on Amazon and you buy a new plug to put on your toaster, and someone has reviewed the plug, and it's like, who went to give a 3-star review to a plug? What on earth made you do that? But thank you.
It was
for
all
doing
right.
That, but...
It was fine. It did the job, but it didn't come well packaged, and I had to call the customer. Blah blah blah. Yeah, I mean, I get that, but remember, that's the thing is you don't want to concatenate Amazon data and Glassdoor data, because Amazon data is a product, you bought it, it's a transaction, it's a different model.
Yeah.
Glassdoor has a different set of legs. It has a different kind of connection to us, and I know. I've been what I would call poorly treated by companies in the past, and I have been, the evil part of my brain says I could easily leave 5 different Glassdoor reviews, all 1 star, and really kind of tank that company.
Yeah.
And as much as Glassdoor wants to say, oh, that's impossible, I know that it's not. And so it does kind of collect those polarizing emotional views.
Exactly. What is helpful, though, and I think we talked about this before, is the way to handle Glassdoor for me is use use kind of comparisons between you and similar other employers, because then the flaws are consistent.
Yeah.
So if you took your 5 biggest competitors and looked at your data versus their data, the flaws in your data are likely to be similar to the flaws in their data. So you can start to look at, why are they higher rated than us for that, and why are they lower rated than us for that?
Yes.
That starts to become quite useful and quite interesting. And that is something, again, when you're showing your senior stakeholders, they are more interested. They don't know what a score of 4.2 is, but if they can see that the biggest competitor is 4.4, they're interested.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's the way that I find they are useful to a point.
I would also add, the one, and I'll happily beat up Glassdoor all day long. One of the value adds I think they put in was they did some very basic pattern recognition to say, these are the 3 or 4 most common pros and 3 or 4 most common cons.
Yeah.
And I think that's incredibly useful, because inside an industry, you will find those pros and cons to be surprisingly similar. So if you're in an industry and you're like, oh, everybody hates us because we have bad work-life balance and our leadership is bad, and I'll say, yeah, look at the other 5 companies. That's exactly what they say. So is that really the problem you're trying to solve? It allows you to have that perspective of, this is what people in this space are complaining about.
Completely. And, I think there's a thing that people do, which is a mistake, which is to get very, very hurt by any criticism of your business, and try not to take it too personally, and look at, but is this something everyone in our sector gets criticized for, or is this specific to us? So, if you are any kind of consultancy or agency, people are going to grumble on Glassdoor that they had to work really hard and things were chaotic. Because that's just working in an agency or consultancy. It is inherently chaotic and changing, and all the rest of it. So don't take it too personally if you get kicked for that. If you look at your competitors, I bet they do as well. And so you can start. It's the differences that start to become relevant. And you're right. That kind of top most mentioned things, either positive or negative, is quite helpful, because somewhere in those top most mentioned things might lie something that's quite fundamental to your EVP, for example.
Exactly.
Is that's suddenly going to be quite useful. So do use it. It is useful. It has similar but different flaws to something we'll come on to, I think, which is staff survey data, which we can get into. But I think there's also other external data sources on how you are seen, and this is where you can get into some off the shelf stuff. And do I go and buy a survey from someone who surveyed a big population about how they see a bunch of employers and see how I rank within that?
Sure.
And there are probably some of you doing that. There are probably some of you who are every year buying a data set.
Yeah.
I would ask you all to look hard on why you're buying it every year, and what difference would it make if we stopped buying it for a year and just bought it every other year, because you might be able to recover yourself a substantial amount of budget by doing that. Are you doing something with the annual changes? So if something goes from 20% to 22%, do you actually do anything any differently? And sometimes you'd be able to say, yes, Marcus, actually we do. When that number changes by a small amount, we do this differently. Some of you go, no, we don't really, do we? Knowing it's roughly 20% is quite useful. Yeah. But that's not going to change from year to year, is it?
It's kind of like measuring your height every week. I mean, really?
Exactly. It's probably a good thing to do every few years to check that you're not shrinking and your spine isn't curving. But I mean, if I started measuring myself annually, it's not going to change very much.
You're not 10, Marcus.
Well, exactly. I can predict from this age onwards which way it's going as well. I'm gradually going to compress. But it's you need to look at these things and go, do I have enough of what I need? Actually, sometimes some of you have got too much. And the problem you have with data is you're collecting too much of it. And you'd be better off going, let's get a bit more selective about which ones I'm really going to look at. Yeah. And giving yourself fewer headaches in terms of all of those.
And if you're not actually ready to change something, do not measure a thing. It is an absolute waste of time, because the purpose of measuring thing is to say, where should I change and how should I change? And if you're not willing to change, there's a million other places you could spend that money.
Completely. The other external data source, just before we get onto internal data, that some of you may have looked at, and I just want to give you a big warning on it, big flashing red light, is someone at some point will say, shall we do some social listening? And this sounds like a good idea because it works really well in the world of consumer. It could have gone into our last episode about the differences. But if you do some social listening about how people feel about you as a business, it depends what kind of business you are, how good that data is going to be. If you are a commercial business that has customers, all the noise on the social listening will be people who are your customers.
All of it.
All of it. So you won't be able to find the job ones within it. So social listening, you could do it, but it'd be quite difficult to do well. It'd be quite expensive to find the data within it that was actually about who you are as an employer.
Yeah, and there was like, and this is a million years ago, there was a tool that did some pretty interesting Boolean searches, and you're like brand, and then you're like, plus jobs, plus career, plus your job, all these other things. It's so much work, and the data's not that helpful.
It also depends on whether your employment has a brand. Now, the only one I can think of where this is a case is, and it's actually a dismissive thing, is there was a thing a while ago about the McJob.
Yeah.
And people would refer to the McJob. So McDonald's could look at what are people saying about McJob. But we kind of know what that's going to be already. If anybody's using that phrase, they are being negative, probably.
Yeah.
So is there any point us doing the social listening exercise? Well, probably not. It might be interesting. Well, you always know it's one of these ones that does end up being a word cloud because no one knew what to do with what they found.
Yep.
So I just warn people off being missold social listening by someone who's trying to make money out of you.
Totally.
Check their methodology and go, ask them the question, how are you going to disambiguate between what people thought about us as a business and what people think about us as an employer? And if they don't have a very, very good answer, tell them to go away. They might have a very good answer, though. This is the sort of thing that I absolutely believe someone could program an AI to do. Yep, that is definitely feasible.
Except,
I haven't seen one yet.
Chances are the sample size is going to be so small. Like, how many employees do you have, and how many of them are look, there are plenty of people complaining about you online and never use your name. If you look at Reddit's anti-work and all these threads, trust me, your companies are in there. You just don't know it, and you'll have no way of extracting it.
What's the secret ingredient in a great career site? It isn't the photo or the headline. It's not the layout or the features. The secret to a great career site is that it is based on a strategy, one that takes advantage of a company's unique resources and presents it in a compelling package. Are you getting the strategy you need to build a great career site from your employer brand or recruitment marketing agency? If you'd like to learn more about how a strategy-focused approach leads to a better career site, check out the award-winning work from ThirtyThree, with offices in New York, London, and Bristol.
So I think the major thing we have left to talk about is the internal data set. And this is where, in theory, things get a lot better. But I think there are also...
Theory is the right word.
So, the staff survey. So often when I start working with a client and we're doing an employer brand project, they'll say, do you want all of our staff survey data? And, the honest in my heart of hearts answer is no, I don't want all of that data. But the answer is, yes, I will probably have to look at it. And I mean... in theory, you've asked everyone who works for you some questions about what it is like to work for you. That should be pretty useful. The problem is, how good were the questions you asked? How good are the answers they decided to give you? And also, hugely, what is the machine you've used to collect that data, and how is it now stored, and how searchable is it? So I spent a lot of the early part of my career dumping people's data into Excel and creating pivot tables and doing all the kind of manipulation because that was what I had to do.
Yeah.
These days, quite a lot of you have bought a better front-end portal that allows you to do some data interrogation yourself. And you're able to look at that data set and go, how do women feel about our business versus how do men feel about our business? How do people at this kind of level feel versus that level? How do people in this geography or this business division? Most of you are now buying a survey supplier that in theory can run some of those reports for you.
Yeah.
And some of them are pretty good. Some of them are, and have the, the fuzzy logic to look at all the open-ended answers and group them together. Okay, that now starts to become useful. But, hugely this is going to be about scale. If you're an employer with less than 100 people, you can look at your entire survey data.
Yeah, and keep it all in your head.
Exactly, and you can read the survey, and it starts to make sense. If you're an employer with 10,000 employees, you're not going to do that. No one's going to do that. Everyone is, I'm afraid, now a number, and you are now going to be analysing big chunks of data. And it gets quite hard. Quite a lot of clients have, paid for my time in the past to come in and tell them what their staff survey says, even if they've commissioned someone else to do the survey, because it is quite difficult to kind of navigate your way around it.
Yeah.
And some of the data companies are going to do very weird things, like they've asked everyone questions on a Likert scale of strongly agree, neutral, disagree, and disagree. And then at some point, they've suddenly decided to switch that into good and bad. And they've gone, right, those ones are the people who are happy, and those ones... Hang on a minute, justify why you've decided that cut-off point. They don't have a very good answer if you press them there. But you've got to look at that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I love it when people refer to Likert scale as if it's, oh, and this makes it accurate. Like, no, that's just a way of looking at data. It's a whole different ballgame.
Yes.
I'd also add, and I think to your point about these tools that are collecting this data, I have now started to see some really interesting AI tools that not only do they just kind of go, let's just dump it all in a big pile and pick out the top 5 words, which, you see in a Glassdoor type thing. It is really about saying they look at each individual answer. They effectively rewrite that answer into a more structured, more standardized framework, and then they start to apply some measurement and extraction techniques. And then they can even say, okay, once having extracted, go back to the original kind of quote and pull out interesting words. So I think these tools are going to start to develop these things to say it's not just about how do I query it, it's really about having almost like a secondary methodology of extracting useful information around this. Hey, can you, based on someone complaining or raving about a job, tell me what their motivations for working in a place are? Can you look at this data to say, this is a place, the thing that they cared most about was work from home, but if they couldn't get that, they probably cared most about salary. That is where things are going to get really interesting in like a hurry. And once you start to have that, you're actually both going to have better information, but also a more complicated problem of how much do you trust that? And how do you unpack that to say, is this live or is this Memorex?
I think the other exciting thing that starts to become more possible now with better data analysis is it is more possible than ever before to start segmenting your audience not by where they are in your organization, but by what they want, and going, right, there are a bunch of people who work for us who want this, whatever age they are and whatever gender they are. There are a bunch of people who work for us who want this, and you can start clustering groups of employees together and going, there is a category of person who works for us who thinks and behaves this way. What can we do for them? There used to be this thing, I used to talk to a lot of clients, particularly very senior HR clients, about the staff survey and go, what happens when you get a really good score in the staff data is you go, 75% of people are very happy with their training and development. And you all look very happy and you pat yourself on the back. And I go, okay, that's great. A quarter of your organisation aren't. That's bad, right?
That's bad.
You need to flip that number and go, wow, okay. And you need to stop thinking about the 75%. They're fine. Okay, good. We need to think about that 25% and what are we going to do about them? And actually, it's not just the majority view that you should be looking at staff surveys with. You should be looking at that minority group in any number.
The outlier tells the story.
Exactly. If 68% of this, what are the other 32%? What are they doing? I want to know about them. Because actually, it's the people who are not happy with something where there's an action required. The people who are happy, there's no action required.
Yeah, exactly.
And so often we spend a lot of our energy focusing on the big number, and actually we should be flipping it over and thinking, the 100% minus number. Who are they? What are we doing about them? And we might be okay with, some people, you can't please all the people all the time.
Certainly.
But are we okay that 32% of our organisation are not happy with whatever that thing was that got a 68% yay score?
Yeah.
And sometimes you flip it over and you ask it that way, and you go, oh no, we're not okay with nearly a third of our organisation being unhappy about that. We better go and do something then. And that suddenly becomes a to-do list that some of you might be involved in, because sometimes it's not actually a problem, it's a perception problem. We come back to this one a few times during the podcast, but internal mobility is a really good example.
Yeah.
You at some point in your survey, you're going to ask people, do you feel there are opportunities for advancement? And they're going to say yes or no on one of these scales. Actually, sometimes just making people aware that there are opportunities improves that number. It's not actually about improving the number of opportunities. It's about the awareness of those opportunities is what's going to move that score. And you in employer branding and internal comms and recruitment marketing, you might play a significant role in fixing that problem.
Totally.
Because it's a perception problem, not a reality problem for some of you.
Now, a lot of times, someone was showing me a dashboard, and I was like, this is nice, but but you have to kind of think of the intention. What was this dashboard? What was this tool designed to tell me? And a lot of dashboards are designed to feel like the check engine light on your car's dashboard. It is, everything is fine up until the moment this thing happens, and then all you know is something is wrong. And that is of value, certainly, to an executive who's got 4 trillion things to worry about, knowing that they don't have to worry about internal mobility, have to worry about employee engagement, have to worry about certain things is of value. And then knowing, I have to worry about that, that's useful. However, it doesn't say what's wrong. It doesn't suggest a to-do list. It doesn't suggest
No.
we're defining a problem. And I think more dashboards are focused on telling you everything is fine or telling you things are bad to sell you something, rather than saying, hey, look, you have 4,000 things that could be wrong. 3,998 of them are fantastic, but these two are going to kill you. These are the two that you should be spending your time on thinking about.
So one thing I've done, the interesting thing is all the things in a staff survey are not of the same type.
True.
And that often becomes very problematic. Sometimes when I've been showing top line survey data back to the leadership of a business, one of the things I've done is I've shown them, right, I'm about to show you the scores for these 10 things that are the top level scores out of your thing. Mm-hmm. I want you in the room to tell me, what do you think would be an acceptable score at which you guys would go, yeah, it's fine, we don't need to do anything.
You are so mean.
But it's important to get them to think about that before you show them the answers, because there are some things where an acceptable answer might be 60%. Yeah, if 60% of our organisation are happy with that, that's fine.
Yeah.
Whereas there is other things where actually anything less than 100% is not okay.
Yeah.
So, do you feel like you've been discriminated against within this business? The acceptable score is 0, right? Anything more than 0 is a problem.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas, do you understand the business strategy? Okay, it'd be lovely if everyone did, but actually an acceptable score might be lower than that because some people are new and some people are very junior and something. Right? Actually, there's probably an acceptable score that's lower than that.
Certainly.
And I think the other thing people forget is there's some people you employ to be dissatisfied within your organisation. So your head of innovation should not be happy with the direction of your business.
Oh, I like that. Oh, I like that a lot.
And actually, there will be divisions with it. So every time, if we do a survey at 33 and we ask people, do you think everything's fine how it is? The answer should be no, because we've hired a bunch of people who like changing things and improving things and doing things differently.
Yes.
And if everybody was happy, we've got a problem.
That is so true.
Because we ought to have people who are determined that they know how the business should be run. And, I think it annoys our leadership team, but, actually below them there is a whole population of people who think they could run the business better. Good. That's exactly the kind of people who...
It's creative friction. You're expecting. You can't create things if everybody's complacent, and that's true. I mean, look, if we're all living, if this was 50 years ago, we were all working in factories and there was a set, spec, and we were all meeting it, you'd want everybody to be happy enough. We are now dealing a world where most of our best employees are creative, and that means 98% of the time they're going to be frustrated because they've put a challenge or a question in front of them, or had something put in front of them where they're going, no one's ever solved this before. This is really complicated. This is really hard. And like trying to, invent a compound or doing a thing. It takes a lot of failure to come up with the right way of doing it. And those moments of failure rarely feels like, I'm getting there. It always feels like I'm never going to get there. And then one day, click, it works. And you're like, I can't believe it works. And that feels good. But yeah, that's got to influence those scores.
Completely. And if you said to me, 60% of our business are unhappy with the way that our business is being run, I'm going to go, great. Remind me what your business is. Yeah. If you're kind of, I don't know, a healthcare business, that's a problem, because that means it's probably the clinical staff are very unhappy with the management.
Yeah, if your nurses are unhappy, you're done. You're in trouble.
Yeah. Whereas if you're a management consultancy, fine. Actually, you want that number higher. They all think they should be running businesses. So, actually, they should all think they've got a better way of running it. Well, exactly, right. Yeah. So you've got to look at these scores rationally, and it's always back to this thing. So with an awful lot of data sets, I talk to junior people when they come into the industry. I talk to them about the who, when, why, and what. And you go, right, who did you ask and when did you ask them? And therefore, how relevant and valid is this? So with an internal data set, it's an entirely relevant data set. With an external data set, you start going, okay, the people I'm interested in are a small subset of this. And when is, how recent is this data? And that's going to give you a sense of how valid and relevant is this data set. The why thing is, why were they asked this question and what was the incentive of the person doing so? And it has that corrupted my data. But the what thing is the really important thing is, so what? What does this number actually mean? Yeah. Always try and convert. If someone gives you a percentage, try and convert it into a real number. So, 32% of our staff think this. Convert it into the real number. That means 6,200 people said that.
Yep.
Or, whatever it is in your case. Convert it to the actual real number and exactly what it is that they said, because that's much harder to ignore than a percentage, especially when you're talking to your senior stakeholders. And then ask yourself this question, does that change anything? If that number had been twice as big, what would I do differently? If that number was half as big, what would I do differently? And if the answer is, nah, not really anything, it's not a very valuable piece of data. Yeah. But if it's, oh my word, if that was twice as big, I would completely rip up my plan and do something different. Okay, that's an important number. We need to pay a lot of attention to it. And it's not a bad rule.
No, and I've seen so many kind of executive teams look at and be handed data or given the data they asked for, and all they're doing is doing this kind of dissection to unmake the survey.
Yeah.
Hey, it turns out that 40% of our people aren't satisfied with their leadership. Do you think they mean their direct manager? Do you think they mean their department team? Do you think they mean the C-suite? Do they mean what do they mean? Well, we can't possibly know what that means. So the fact that 40% of the people are dissatisfied with their leadership, we don't know anything what we can do, and so we can ignore that. It's a way of obfuscating to avoid responsibility, avoid making changes, and that to me is the biggest red flag in looking at data. If you look at the data and you want to react, I get that. That should be an instinct. If you look at the data and you go, let me see if I can find a way to make this go away, you got bigger problems.
But some of the obfuscation has happened in advance. My favourite bad question in a survey that I grumble every time I see it is, there's this question gets asked a lot in surveys, and employer brand people quite often get quite excited about the answer, and it's, would you recommend us as an employer?
Oh, yeah.
Right?
The standard,
now,
NPS scores. Yes, I have lots of challenges
However,
with NPS.
The problem I have with that question is, why have we gone into the subjunctive mood? Right? Why are we asking, would you recommend us? The question should be,
did you?
Have you recommended us as an employer? Exactly, right? Why have we gone hypothetical here? Because that allows someone to say, oh, well, I would, but actually I didn't. Or, actually asking someone, have you recommended someone us as an employer, will give you a lot better sense of how people really feel about you and whether they're really endorsing you and whether they are being an employee advocate. Because someone who is theoretically an employee advocate is absolutely no use to you. You need someone who's actually an employee advocate. And so it's a much better question to ask, have you recommended us as an employer to anyone?
Yeah. Though I imagine the gap.
The number will go right down.
Yeah.
But it's a much more accurate number.
But the gap is interesting because it will also tell you a little bit of, look, you don't have a lot of room. No one's going to refer you. Look, this number is not going to get better. Or, look, you just have a bad referral structure. You haven't put it in place. You haven't communicated. I will not get into the conversation of, is it a good reward system? Because I think that's not germane. But if 80% of the people say they would recommend it and 5% have, I want to go in and talk to the referral team and say, what are we not doing?
But it's much harder to argue with the data when you've asked hard questions.
Correct.
So, if instead of saying, do you think we are an equitable and fair employer, it's, have you seen someone in the last 3 years be treated unfairly?
Ooh.
Right? And actually,
yes.
Yeah. But then you've got a hard number that no one can argue with, rather than a kind of vague mood about what I think might be the case, in my opinion, on this day. I think the other thing to remember about staff survey data is, whenever you did it, if you sent out exactly that same survey 2 hours later, you get a different answer.
Yep.
My feeling about my employer and everyone else's feeling about their employer is not a static thing. No. You can do a survey, and what you've got is a Polaroid photo of how people felt at that moment that they opened that survey, not how they normally feel.
Yeah.
And it's going to go up and down. I feel happier at the end of the day than I do at the start of the day. I probably feel happier at the end of the week than I do at the start of the week. How I feel depends on how the meeting I just had went.
Yes.
That actual feeling about you is going to fluctuate hugely for reasons that are not your fault. And you have to accept that it is absurd to say that any piece of staff survey emotion data is 22.8%. No, it isn't. It was 22.8% at that moment when those people were out then. It has already changed.
Yeah.
So I get very annoyed when I see people doing trend lines on their 2023 survey versus their 2022 survey. And I go, you do realise it's gone up and down more between that. Than that change.
And there's value in a pulse survey to give you an indication and see some trends.
Yeah,
but you're right.
definitely.
It's very flexible. My personal favorite question, which I always proffer and has yet to be accepted, and you'll understand once I tell you what the question is. The question is not, would you recommend this to a friend, or, do you like working here? The question is, if you knew then what you know now about working here, would you still want to work here?
Oh,
we're done.
Ooh.
We're done.
That is a great question. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of the flip of the question I quite often ask when I'm trying to generate EVP stuff is I ask people, what should we have told you that we didn't?
Yes.
Which is kind of the flip of that.
I asked that by saying, what was surprised you when you came in?
Yeah.
So what did what were expectations? How were they set versus the reality of showing up?
But your original point about expectations is a good one. Whether it's Glassdoor or whether it's the staff survey is, some of you have set yourselves up by hiring incredibly demanding people,
Yeah.
by saying, like, everybody who comes here is going to make an impact, right? Well, now you've said that, everyone's going to expect to make an impact. If you said we're an incredibly innovative business, how innovative is everybody's job? You've got some people who are doing innovative stuff, but you are setting some of these expectations, which you are then scored upon.
Yeah, and that includes the HR team, whose sense of what innovation is going to be a little different than your development coding team.
Completely. Like, that word means different things to different people. But you do set some of the expectations with people. But also, don't forget, this survey is setting expectations as well. If you ask me the question, have you had a meeting with your manager about your development? Right, you've just set an expectation that that's a thing that should happen.
Yep.
Right, so which didn't necessarily exist in my head until you asked me that question. And so you need to look at the survey that you have bought off the shelf, quite possibly, and go, we are about to tell a bunch of people this is what they should be getting from us. Did we mean that? Or actually, do we need to edit or take out some of those questions? Because frankly, those aren't things that we think we should be doing.
Yeah.
But as soon as you ask people, are you getting this? I'm going to think I should be getting that. Yeah. Or at least that you intended for me to get that thing.
Yeah, it's like if your spouse comes out and says, do I look okay? And you say, did you change your hair? Suddenly they're going, what's wrong with my hair? What's happening with my hair? The question itself changes the perception of what expectations are.
Absolutely. And, the reality is your life would be a lot easier if people's expectations were a bit lower, and they would be more content with what they're getting.
Except we'd have a harder time attracting people because you could, there's not much of a message to say, we're kind of like everybody else. Come on in.
It's fine. Although actually that would be incredibly distinctive. One company did that. They could have a rating. Yeah. It's like the value brand at the supermarket. Yeah. Right. There's a market for it. Right. But very few people want to be there. But yeah, I mean, you've got to think through that. This survey data is quite useful to you as an input. Back to the topic of the day is it is useful. But even that, you can't overread. You should have a higher completion rate on it. It'll be a lot easier to cut. You can at least ask the questions about how it was done, and you can probably get a good answer about all of that. But again, if you get lost in it, go and find someone else who understands that data set better. There should be someone within your organisation whose job is predicated on that data set. There's probably someone in marketing who could help you look at it. Your agency should be able to help you look at it if you've got an agency, or a consultant if you're working with a consultant. Ask for their advice, because they probably looked at loads of these before.
They've given them a lot of times.
Well, exactly. I've written them, I've analysed other people's, I've used them as inputs. I can probably quickly go, oh yeah, this old chestnut. Fine, the people who work for you for 5 to 10 years are disenchanted. Yes, that is true at every company. It's a survivor error. The people who are really angry quit really quickly.
Yep.
And the people who've been there for 20 years love you, because otherwise they would have gone in the meantime. The 5 to 10 years is the people who've got slightly annoyed but haven't quit yet. It's where you find the disenchantment. Yeah.
Any other data we should be looking at before we wrap this up?
I think that's probably it for input data. I mean, there's a million other things we could do, but I think that's probably like the main ones you're going to encounter for input data, at least how I'm looking at it. I think then next time we will get onto the output data.
Yeah.
The how are we measuring things? How are we measuring ROI? It's the one that everybody is still talking about, and no one's got a perfect answer. But hopefully we can give you some steer on where to look and where not to look.
Exactly. All right. This has been a fantastic question, Marcus, or fantastic conversation, Marcus. I appreciate you did a bulk of the talking, because this is where you live. So I love. I'm glad I got you to laugh once or twice here. So that's the win. Absolutely. To me. So otherwise, I think to everybody else listening, that I presume they learned a lot, because I know I certainly did.
Fantastic. Well, I hope so. And if you have other burning questions that we didn't cover to do with input data, leave us a message on the voicemail on the website, because we almost certainly did miss something that you're looking at. We'd love any thoughts about anything else you'd like us to cover, but hopefully that's been the big ones for most people.
I think it's a great start. All right, I'll see you next week.
See you next week, James.
Thanks for listening to The Brand Plan. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we'd appreciate it if you'd spread the word.